Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our monthly Monday Speaker Series. Today we have the pleasure of hearing our friend and neighbor, Jim O'Sullivan. Jim and his wife, Janet Porter, moved from Windmill Harbor to Tide Point last April 2024. Jim was born and raised in New York City. He went to high school and college there, and upon graduation was recruited by the Columbia Gas Systems Corporation, where he spent his entire 33-year career. That's rare today. Upon retirement in 1998, Jim had some interesting experiences as national president of the Mercedes-Benz Club of America. He was he was a volunteer for the domestic and international medical courier carrying bone marrow to leukemia patients. Jim would also like to respond to some of the stories his wife, Janet, told during her Tide Point talk last November. Please join me in welcoming Jim O'Sullivan.
Thank you very much, Lee. Thank you very much for that delightful, I was going to say invocation. There's a message there, that introduction, right? As Lee said, I was born and raised in New York City, but I have a few comments before that. I did write, and you did read in the Tide publication, as Lee said, I was going to reply or rebut to several of my wife Janet Porter's comments when she made her Tide Point talk last November. However, recently during the night, I had a revelation. I woke up and I was reminded of what happened 2 nights before we got married. My best man took me out to dinner, and he taught me how to be married. I had been married earlier, which I'll mention later, but I loved the euphemism. I was divorced. The euphemism is single again. I was single again for 10 years, so my best man was concerned that I had forgotten. And he taught me how to say good things like, yes, dear. You're right, dear. Again, dear. As always, dear. And I didn't forget that, and I would hate to commit marital suicide, so I'm not going to rebut anything Janet said that night. With one exception. Those of you who are here and may remember, she began her remarks by talking about an incident when she was the Associate Dean at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And she was lecturing to a group of graduate students. And as Janet says, she thought she was really compelling. She really thought she was telling them things that would change their lives. They took a break, and several of the students came up to her and asked if they could talk to her. And she said, of course. And one student hung back. Her name was Yvonne. And finally, the other students left, and Yvonne came up and said, Dr. Porter, can we speak? And Janet said, of course. And she says, no, Dr. Porter, can we speak over there? And Janet thought she didn't want the other students to hear her gushing about what a great job she was doing. So she went over and said, yes, Yvonne. And Yvonne looked at her and said, Dr. Porter, I've been looking at you during your lecture. Your pants are on inside out. And Yvonne said, at first I thought it was wearing a tuxedo stripe, like a satin stripe. Then I said, no, those are seams. And she went on, she said, Dr. Porter, it's after 2 o'clock. Your pants have been on inside out all day. And Janet was surprised, and then this is what really killed Janet. Yvonne complimented her and said, Janet, I'm really surprised because for an older woman, you really dress nice. Janet was 45 years old. That's as much as I'm going to do rebutting or replying to Janet, except to tell you and put your minds at ease. The very last thing I did before coming into the ballroom tonight, I went into the men's room and I checked. My pants are on outside out, and yes, they are zipped, so you can stop looking right now. There's a vast body of academic research, and it has researched audience reaction to speakers. And unusual for academic research, the results are very similar, if not the same. And the research shows that audiences pay strict attention to the speaker for the first 10 minutes. And if the speaker speaks between 10 and maybe 20 minutes, members of the audience begin to daydream. And if the speaker drones on beyond 20 minutes or 30 minutes, various members of the audience begin to have sexual fantasies. So I want to thank Lee for giving me 3 hours this evening. I promise you you'll enjoy it. But no, I'm painfully aware that 5:59 can come, and I can't go beyond that because I will be in the terrible position of being between you and cocktail hour. As Lee said, I was born in New York City. I was raised in Upper Manhattan, a community called Washington Heights. If any of you saw the play In the Heights or the movie In the Heights, that was filmed in my neighborhood. So that's where I lived. We lived, and everybody lived, in a 5-story walk-up apartment building. They were and are called tenements. And the reason they were 5 stories is because the law at that time required a building 6 or more stories high to have an elevator in it. That's why we lived in a walk-up. And as we at Tide Point have found, elevators are rather expensive, especially when you install them, repair them, maintain them, or in our case, replace them. So the builders and the landlords never put elevators in, so it was a walk-up tenement. It was a very diverse neighborhood, to use today's word. The 5 stories, most of the parents, and there were a lot of kids, most of the parents came here from a different country. And I used to hear the word immigrant. I had no idea what immigrant meant. I finally found out, and it means somebody who came to the United States from another country. My parents were immigrants. They both came to this country in their 20s, in the 1920s. My mother was born in Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. My father was born in the Republic of Ireland. And they met in this country, they got married. Here I am. I have an older sister and a younger brother. The other word I heard frequently, and I didn't know what it meant, was refugees. And I knew there were a lot of refugees, I could tell by listening to my parents. And I finally found out refugees who left or escaped from another country. In this case, many of the refugees in my community, they came from Germany, they came from Holland, they came from Poland, they came from Eastern Europe, and they were escaping either before, during, or after the Nazis were taking over Europe, right? And I guess that's how I learned to be refugees, and I still hear that word today, only now we call them aliens or migrants. I went to school, a Catholic school, and it was run by the nuns. The nuns taught me, and yes, they used to hit me on the knuckles with a metal ruler when I misbehaved, which regrettably was too frequent in their opinion. But I went to school. The school was 3 blocks away. And as I'm fond of telling our son, and I'll talk about him later, I went to school and the 3 blocks was uphill both directions. You believe that? And he grew up. In any event, I went and I graduated from there. It was, as I said, uphill both ways. And we used to walk to school 3 blocks. And the kids, the students, well, I'm from New York, it was the boys and the girls. The boys and girls would go down to school together. Occasionally, a parent would escort us, but we walked in groups. It was very safe. There was no problem. And one time, I think it was in the 4th grade, I was walking home from lunch, and I passed the neighborhood drugstore, and the druggist was standing outside. And my family did business there. He knew me. Everybody called me Jimmy, right? And I walked by and he said, Jimmy, hello, would you do me a favor? And I said, yeah, sure, what can I do for you? And he said, come inside. And he said he had a customer, a patient, who had a prescription, medicines. And she was waiting for her medicine, and would I deliver the medicine to this woman and then come back and give him the money? And I said, sure. The medicine, you're gonna love this. Do you remember when 100 tablets were $1.75? In any event, it was $1.75. The pharmacist gave me change. He gave me a quarter, 25 cents. He also gave me 3 $1 bills and 1 $5 bill. So I had change of $2, $5, or $10. The woman was so happy to see me, Jimmy, and I gave her the medicine, and she gave me money. I gave her change, and son of a gun, she gave me back 25 cents, a quarter. And I looked at that, and man, 4th grade, I was rich. But anyhow, I brought the money back to the druggist, and he said, would you mind stopping by every day when you're going to lunch and after school, and if necessary? So I did that for several years, as we called it, running prescriptions. And man, I was an entrepreneur. I had money, like, $3, big time. And then finally, I probably was in the 6th, maybe the 7th grade, and he asked me if I would consider working in the drugstore occasionally after school and on Saturdays, and refilling the shelves as the merchandise was sold. The drugstore, the lower level, now called the basement of the drugstore was the stock room. And we would get drugs delivered in boxes. I would take the cartons down, put them on metal shelves, and then, for instance, as we sold cough medicine, I'd go down and get 6 bottles of cough medicine and put it on the shelf. And he taught me to rotate stock. That is, you put the newest in the back. That way the merchandise is always fresh. I learned that habit. I'm still aware of it. But I'm sorry to say, in my opinion, many of the supermarkets on Hilton Head Island don't practice that. The new stuff is right up front, the old stuff is in the back, and by the time you buy the old stuff, it's out of date. But I did that, and then sooner or later, I graduated, and he asked me if I would become a counter clerk. And I had my own cash register drawer. I was doing rather well. I enjoyed it. And to show you, to show you what a small world it is, Janet and I were having dinner not long after we got here to Tide Point, and we were having dinner with Bob and Judy Schreiger. And Bob is a pharmacist, and he's from New York State, Long Island, I think, and he went to Fordham University, and he starts out, I said, whoa. And he said, he went for his pharmacy degree, and when he was a senior, he told me he used to take the bus for an hour and a half to the end of the line, and then walk 7 blocks, and he was a pharmaceutical apprentice in a drugstore. And I said, oh, where was the drugstore? And he said, Washington Heights. What? And I said, where? And he said, 189th Street and St. Nicholas Avenue. And I looked at him and I said, you worked at S. Stahl Drugs. His eyes lit, yes, I did. And I said, I worked at S. Stahl Drugs. We never figured out whether we were contemporaries. We may have been, but I was the stock boy or the prescription runner when he was pharmaceutical apprentice. And he remembered the names of the brother. It was S. Stahl Drugs. S was one of the brothers that owned it, and his nickname, everybody knew him as Sonny. And Bob didn't know what his real name was until I told him S was for Saul. The other brother was C.W., and that's how he was called, C.W. And Bob didn't know that, but in any event, I told him C.W. was Charles William. And the other one, each one of us remembered another pharmacist was there. We couldn't remember, and as Bob was talking, the light went on, and I just interrupted him and said, Irving Jarmel. That's it. So that's a small world, especially here in Tide Point. I graduated from high school, and the high school I went to was a small boys-only school. Remember them? And it was in Midtown Manhattan on 85th Street and Park Avenue. With the Upper East Side, it was very, very nice. And I can remember going to school, taking the bus down, an express bus, it took an hour, and then I'd walk 2.5 blocks to Regis High School, and I had a classic Jesuit liberal arts education, and I'll refer to that later on. But in any event, when I went to Manhattan College, I decided to study engineering. And I went from classic liberal arts, 4 languages plus English, art, appreciation, the whole bit, to engineering. Now, we did take mathematics and advanced math in high school, but I did have a difficult first year going from a Jesuit liberal arts school to an engineering school. I've often wondered, why did I choose to become an engineer? And I remember a couple of things when I was growing up. We had a 1-bedroom apartment. I had an older brother, a younger sister, so there were 5 of us, and various sleeping arrangements. At night, my parents would roll out cots, and my brother and I would sleep in a cot, and the cot went in the closet again in the morning. But it worked fine, and we grew up. We moved downstairs to a 2-bedroom apartment, where I actually had my own bedroom with my brother. I shared it. My sister always slept in the master bedroom with my parents. But in the old apartment and the new apartment, there was one of these big console radios. It was a Philco radio. It was a beautiful wooden case. I think my mom had a clock on the top of it. And if you turned it on, it lit up, the dial lit up, and it was 4 dials. And the top dial had call letters of the New York City radio stations. WOR, WABC, WINS, and I used to turn it on and tune the radio, and I could hear those radio stations. And I would switch to the other, and the bands would light up, and all I heard was static. And one day, when there was nobody else in the apartment, I remember struggling, and really struggling, and pushing this big console radio out from the wall, and looking at the back. And the tubes were all lit up. It was on this steel box that I later found out is called a chassis. And I'm looking at it, and there was this funny looking device on the chassis, and engraved in the chassis were the letters ANT. I had no idea what ANT was. So I pushed the radio back, and one day I walked a half a mile to our public library. I asked the librarian, she took me to the reference library, opened a book, and there was a picture of the console type radio in the back, the tubes and everything. And she pointed to this device that said ANT, and I said, "What's that?" She said, "That's an antenna." I said, "Oh, what's an antenna?" And she said, "Oh, that's wire. And if you put the wire on that device," which she correctly called a Fahnestock clip, that's what it's known as. If you put the wire, you'll get radio signals. This is, hey. I walked home, don't forget, I had money in my pocket. I was working in the drugstore. I stopped in the local hardware store and told him I wanted to roll a wire. Why? For an antenna. Oh, okay. And he brought me a roll of 25 feet of wire. And he told me that, you have to strip the insulation so that the wire touches the clip. And I didn't know how to strip it, so I used my teeth. Half an inch of insulation. And I remember, again, one time there was nobody in the house, pardon me, and I pushed the radio out, and it's all lit up and everything, and I put on band 2 and got nothing, and I connected the wire 25 feet, I unrolled it, and all of a sudden, the world exploded into my ears. And I started tuning, and I heard, like the dial said, London, Paris, Rome, Italy, Moscow, all this. And that got me interested in shortwave radio. And that probably is the reason why when I went to high school, I was a freshman in high school, and I looked at the activities, and I saw they had a radio club. And they taught radio. I learned the Morse code. I learned elementary radio theory. And at age 14, I got an amateur radio license, known as a ham radio license. And I'm proud to say, more than 60 years later, I still have that same call letters, and I do have an amateur radio license. No, I think Tide Point would frown on me if I put antennas on the roof and black coax down the wall and everything. So instead, I have a little walkie-talkie. It's smaller than these index cards, and it has a long antenna. And sometimes from home, I use the walkie-talkie. Occasionally in the car, I have it. And it's a very low power, and I can call and hit what we call a repeater, which is on the fire towers around here and the water towers, there's antennas. Other hams have established repeaters. They hear my weak signal, and they rebroadcast my strong signal, and other people can hear me. They hit, and we talk via repeaters. The other thing that I did before I discovered girls, when I was in high school and college, frequently in the evening and on Saturdays, I had a big ham radio station. I worked, I was able to buy nice equipment. And I ran the maximum power allowed, which was 1,000 watts. It was called a kilowatt. And frequently, by schedule, I would contact soldiers and scientists in Antarctica at McMurdo Sound. And we had a system that was called a phone patch. I could connect my transmitter and my receiver to my telephone at home, and the people in Antarctica knew this. And let's say I spoke to a scientist and his wife and family were in Nebraska. And I said, would you like to speak to your wife? And he said on the air, he wasn't supposed to. Austin is going to bleep me. He said, hell yes. All right? And I would make a long distance call through the operator, and the wife would answer, and I would explain what it was. And after a while, they got familiar with it. And if they accepted the long distance charges, a collect call, they could talk to their husband or their spouse in Antarctica through my radio station. And I did that for years. And I still, as I said, have a ham radio license. It was a lot of fun. The other reason I think I was interested in engineering, Fifth Avenue and Park Avenue were very elite neighborhoods. They had a lot of expensive cars on the street, parked on the street. We didn't have cars in my neighborhood. The first car I remember was a 1954 Chevrolet Bel Air, two-door hardtop. It was light yellow and green, all of those colors needed. But I would walk 2.5 blocks to school and I'd see all these cars. Many of them had this funny hood on them that looked like a three-pointed star. And in the back it would say Mercedes-Benz. And I got fascinated and I read about Mercedes-Benz and I was fascinated with German engineering. And occasionally, toward the end of the year on a Friday when I was at 85th and Park, I would take the bus down to 52nd, I think it was, Street and Park Avenue. And that was the location for Mercedes-Benz of New York. If it's still existing, it is an historical monument because it was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. It had walls of glass on 2 stories and all these gleaming Mercedes-Benz inside, including the gull wing. Oh yeah, the gull wing. And I remember it happened twice. But there I was, this kid with my school books, and I'm looking at the cars. There was one rotating, and a salesman would come out. And he said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "No, I'm just dreaming." And he said, "Come on in." And one salesman gave me a book, the marketing book for the Mercedes-Benz Gullwing. Another time, a salesman brought me in, and he let me sit in a Mercedes-Benz. But I was aware that Mercedes-Benz and German engineering, and I think that influenced my becoming an engineer. And I went, as I said, to Manhattan College. Manhattan College was in the Bronx, but it moved to where the land was available. It was in Manhattan. And last August, after more than 100 years, Manhattan College became Manhattan University. But when I was a freshman, I had stopped working in the drugstore in the late summer after high school. I was a freshman, and I was walking by the student activities, and I saw this index card on the bulletin board, and it said, "Wanted driving instructor." Well, I had a driver's license. Remember, I worked for the drugstore. I had money. I took driving lessons in a driving school. I got my driver's license at 18 in New York, which was the earliest you could get it. The state had junior licenses at 16, but not valid in New York. Well, the guy said, fine. He said, you have to go study, and I studied. And I ended up having to take, you're gonna love this one, a 6-hour written exam by the Department of Motor Vehicles on rules, regulations, everything having to do with it. And then I passed that, and I took a 3-hour driving exam up and down New York City, through Times Square, you name it, parking, the whole bit. And I remember the inspector, when he got in my car, it was my friend's car, he said, if you make one wrong move, you fail. That sort of gets your attention, but I must have passed because I became a licensed New York State driving instructor, and other students started, and when I was in my sophomore year, the owner wanted to retire and go back to Italy, so I bought the driving school in New York City. When I was a sophomore in college, I hired other students at Manhattan College. We had, forgive me, one hell of a business going. It was really a great business. And it was very interesting because I taught many people. It was a nice community. It's sort of a neighborhood recreation center. It had a swimming pool, and the locals belonged to it. And one woman came, and I taught her to drive. Well, you spend 8 or 10 hours in a car alone with somebody, and you get to know them. And she told me she was married, and she had 7 children. She had 5 daughters and 2 sons. And the oldest daughter was married. And that's blah, 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 blah. And then I used to give lessons and teach people what they had needed to know for the past to get a learner's permit. And I was giving a class, and the new students came in. And I remember this young woman came in. She was very petite. She was 5 foot tall. She had blonde hair and brilliant blue eyes. And she sat down, and they introduced themselves, and she was one of the woman's daughters, all right? She was the oldest unmarried daughter. And the woman whom I taught to drive had all the other daughters lined up for me to teach them, hoping that one of them would catch me. One of them did catch me, the one I just described. Her name, Irish, Honora, which is also English. Her nickname was Nora. And frankly, she's the only student I ever had that got 2 licenses from me. She got a driver's license and a marriage license. We had a son, Jim Jr. We enjoyed that, and unfortunately the marriage didn't work out, and after several years, I love the euphemism, single again. That means divorced. And divorce is not a word in the Catholic lexicon, so you can imagine being single again was acceptable. And finally, I was recruited, as Lee said, by the Columbia Gas System, which at the time was the country's largest integrated gas system. That meant not only did we hire minorities, but we did everything. We searched for gas in the Gulf, now called the Gulf of America. We searched for gas in Pennsylvania, Louisiana, Texas, Alaska. And if we found it, we produced it, and then we brought it ashore from the Gulf, and we put it in 48-inch pipelines and sent it all the way through the country, as far north as Chicago. We also operated 7 companies we called distribution companies, which sold gas to you, retail customers. And they were interested in a concept. They were looking for an electrical engineer, and they got me. And I took a job with them, and I enjoyed it. I was involved in what we called industrial sales. I had large volume sales, which was big hotels and office buildings. And our main competitor was the electric company. Now, we lived in upstate New York. It was cold. You may remember in January of this year, we had several days here on Hilton Head, and the temperatures were in the 20s. You also might remember that we had an ice and snowstorm, and that didn't help. Tide Point was closed in, etc. Well, imagine that for 6 or 7 months, and that was Binghamton, New York, all right? And, you know, natural gas was the preferred fuel for heating. There was a large regional high school, and without going into details, they decided to use electric heat, which stunned me. That never happened. And And then the city of Binghamton and the state was doing an urban renewal project in downtown Binghamton. They demolished downtown. They built a 20-story state office building, a 9-story county office building, and a 6-story new city hall. And I'll be darned, they went electric heat, which just didn't happen. Nobody would say what was going on. The answer was, I spoke to the engineers, the architects. That's the decision they made. And one day I came into my office and there was a large manila envelope on the desk. It had stamps on it, no postage meter, and there was no return address. And I opened it up and there was a document over an inch thick. And it was a copy of the engineering feasibility study for heating that the electric company had given to the architects, engineers, the school board, and the state. And I think somebody wanted me to know what was going on. And I went through it, and finally we discovered something. And to make a long story short, they were offering what I ultimately called a trick rate. And that was on the theory that lights, motors, everything in a structure, the electricity is dissipated in the form of heat, and therefore they were going to give the entire structure a trick rate of the heating rate at 1 cent a kilowatt hour, which knocked me out of the ballpark. Now, I went to my head office, we all got together and everything, and it just wasn't going to last. We sued the electric company before the Public Utility Commission. They lost, they appealed. We won in the Supreme Court, they appealed. We won in the Court of Appeals, we won in the State Appellate Division. And all the courts said, that's not proper, it's an illegitimate rate, they grandfathered. But I spent a lot of time with in-house lawyers, and then outside counsel, whom I called outhouse lawyers. And of course, the local newspapers and the Albany newspapers loved this. Utilities were fighting each other. So I was the spokesperson. I spent a lot of time on the stand, and I learned, and I started to be involved in what came to be known as public affairs. At the very same time, in Pennsylvania, our biggest state, we were the biggest gas company in the state, that the legislature needed new revenues, as they always do, and they decided to do something which was unheard of. Public utility property, because it was providing a public service, the real estate was never taxed. But they realized the cash cow that would be, and they passed the first public utility realty tax. And just hellacious tax for utilities, which had never been taxed. And, you know, it hit all, my company, it hit all the pipes underground, the gas meters, everything. The electric company, it hit the coals, power stations. We had a nuclear power station 10 miles from Harrisburg. You may have heard of it. It's called 3 Mile Island. That was taxed a couple of $1 million a year. And it was rough. It was a legitimate business expense, so the utilities filed for rates to recover that. So our rates went up. The public went wild because the utilities were raising rates. The legislatures loved it because they got the revenue and we got the blame. But in Pittsburgh, our chairman at the time, an engineer whom I knew, whose name happened to be Jim, not Jimmy, but he knew the state Senate majority leader who lived in Pittsburgh and was a customer of ours. And he took the Senator Zambrelli to dinner one night in the Duquesne Club, which was a lovely dinner club in Pittsburgh. And they were talking, and then he started in beating up on Senator Zambrelli about how could you do this, and it's outrageous and everything, and Zambrelli just cut him off. Just cut him off. And I heard this from both parties, Jim and Senator Zambrelli. And his comment was, in essence, if you don't care enough to have someone in Harrisburg looking out for your interests and your customers' interests, don't come to me after the fact. I told that Jim McKee, the CEO, went back the next morning, had a 2-hour emergency meeting with his senior management, including the lead lawyer on the case that I was involved in New York. And apparently they came to a decision, and my phone in Binghamton, New York, rang about 10:30. And it was Jim McKee. Hi, Jim, how you doing, everything else? Good job with the electric, all this kind of stuff. And he said, I have an offer for you. He said, how would you like to be a lobbyist? And my answer was, I'm not sure what it means, but I'll give it a shot. I came down and I became the first lobbyist in the entire Columbia gas system. I lived in York, Pennsylvania, where we operated because it was 20 miles from Harrisburg. I was responsible for 3 states at the time, Pennsylvania, New York, and Maryland. And I spent time in Harrisburg, Albany, Annapolis, and Washington, D.C. One thing led to another, and the system itself went through an awful lot of restructuring, and distribution companies, including my 3, all moved to headquarters in Columbus, Ohio. The transmission company, the big pipeline, they moved to Charleston, West Virginia. And one day I got a telephone call, and things were tough because those were the days of environmentalism, consumer protection. People took aims. Ralph Nader took aim at utility rates, and I was invited to come to Columbus, and I was elected Vice President of Government Relations for the system. And at the time, I was the youngest vice president in that corporation's history. I don't know whether that record stands today, but I had a wonderful time. It was really wonderful. I spent a lot of time. And to show you lobbyists, right? There was someone that you all know and I hope respect and appreciate. He spent 2 terms as your POA president. His name is John Berryman. John Berryman spent his entire career with the 2nd largest electric supplier in the state of Georgia. And he ended up being the Southern Company's lobbyist in Atlanta and Washington, D.C. And he lobbied members of Congress, including some guy named Newt Gingrich. We exchange war stories. The only difference really is the scale. I had more states. And during my career there, I was very fortunate. We operated, as I said, in 7 states. It became very serious government relations because we're subject to utility regulations, the federal laws, rules, regulations, state. And I was fortunate enough, I did hire 7 lobbyists. We called them directors. They reported directly to me in the States. And one day I got a call from the CEO, and his comment was, Jim, you know, whenever you have a chance, I'd like to spend some time with you for, quote, a strategic chat. I didn't know what that meant, but I'm not going to wait to find out. Guess what? I found more than enough time the next morning. And he told me he was very proud of what I had done, and thank you and everything else. I had lobbied for 20 years. He also said he had some problems in operations, and he knew I was an engineer. He was not worried about succession planning because of the people I hired and mentored and trained. And would I take a job straightening out operations? Of course I did. And I might add that his succession plan was people I hired. And of the 7 people I hired, 4 eventually went on to become presidents of their respective companies. I think that's a pretty good track record. In any event, I became vice president of general services, and I had basically everything except the service people who fixed appliances and the people who put pipes in the street. Everything else, or as I'm fond of saying, everything that nobody wanted. As an example, we operated in 7 states. We had 152 facilities, including several which were big or bigger than Tie Point. They all were in my department. We had an in-house architect and engineering firm. We did our own design, everything. We had motor vehicles, and the system itself was downsizing, right-sizing. You've heard that comment. And they were doing that, and they had a fleet, and they asked me, an operating company executive, to chair the system committee for vehicles. And I was responsible for 8,400 vehicles in 26 states. The same thing, the company ran an Air Force, and they knew I liked aviation. I ultimately got a private pilot's license, but they asked me to be in charge of the aviation department. The pilots loved it because I spoke pilotese, but things like that. And things were going along really terrific. And then we got into all this downsizing, right-sizing, and everything else, all that you hear what's going on today in the federal government. We took a company of 12,000 employees operating in the 7 states down to 7,200. That's a 40% reduction. And we had more coming. The CEO and I did a lot of it, unfortunately. The CEO knew that another wave was coming, and he asked me if I would take the wave and do it again, do another round. And I said, yes, but. And he said, what do you mean, but? And I said, I'm going to eliminate my own job and take a severance package and retire to allow Janet her freedom to go back and travel around being a hospital administrator. He didn't know that. But his response to me was, you can't do that. And I said, I understand that, Bob. And we went on our merry ways, and about a month later, my phone rang, and it was Bob, and he said, can you have a minute? And I went up and he said, does your offer still stand? Yes, it did. So, after 33 years, I retired, and that was in 1998. I had some interesting activities, as Lee said, in my retirement. I had been a long-time member of the Mercedes-Benz Club of America, which was at the time the largest Mercedes-Benz club in the world. We had 21,000 members. We were headquartered, most car makes or marques, they call it, Ferrari, Jaguar, Mercedes-Benz, name it, BMW, Audi, they had clubs, but we were the biggest. And believe it or not, I was elected to the board, the national board, and I walked in and they had checked me out. And they wanted, because of my experience in the States with the club, I was an officer at all the state levels, and they elected me, the board elected me secretary. The next year, they elected me national vice president, and then, lo and behold, I was elected national president. And I served during 2006 and 7. We were term limited to 2 one-year terms. But 2006 was the club's 50th anniversary. And I traveled around the country meeting members in the street, as I call them. They loved it. They never met the national president, with events and everything. And that started something which continues today. Because of the anniversary, Mercedes-Benz in Germany thought it would be a good idea to have club members come and visit their plants and their factories and their museums and everything. And we did that. And we adopted the resolution unanimously, and everybody said, oh, darn it, who are we going to get to do this? Well, yours truly was available. I ended up leading 25 of those trips during the years, maybe 700 or 800 club members throughout Germany. We took club members on trips to Austria and Hungary, to where the big G-Wagen, the 4-wheel drive, was made in Austria. And then we decided to do something exotic, and I led a group of club members for 2.5 weeks to Vietnam and Cambodia, and a week on the Mekong. We were stopped with COVID, but that continues to this day. And I'm pleased to have served. I still serve as sort of a mentor. And frankly, I'm very proud to wear this lapel pin. It shows the Mercedes-Benz logo. It says Mercedes-Benz Club of America, past president. And I also subsequently, after COVID, the first big national meeting, I was, to my great surprise, I was awarded a very special award by Mercedes-Benz. They rarely give it out. In 60 years, they had given it to 7 Americans. I was the 7th. It's called the Silver Star Award. It's given to a non-employee who spent, quote, his lifetime advancing the mark. And that crystal and the certificate is very proudly hung in my den here at Tide Point. The other thing is, after I was no longer the president, I had been, in essence, the CEO of a $2 million corporation with 21,000 members. Janet was worried that I had nothing to do. And she, without my knowledge, volunteered me to just about every charity in New England. I lived in Boston at the time, outside of Boston. And I went to some of the meetings, and frankly, a directorship seat is too valuable to waste. If I had an interest, I stayed. If I didn't, I resigned. And that happened, I think I was down to 2, and one day Janet came home from her hospital, and she said, have I got a job for you? What? And it turned out that her hospital was the Harvard University Cancer Hospital, and they did a lot of transfusions of bone marrow into leukemia patients. And they had employees who went to pick up the bone marrow from a donor, let's just say in Pittsburgh. And this was all employees. I was the first non-employee to be accepted by Dana-Farber. It might have had something to do with my wife's position, but I doubt it very much. They knew I was damn good, right? But in any event, I did that. Domestically. I traveled to almost every state east of the Mississippi, either picking up donation and taking it back to Boston to be transfused into the patient. And then because of my service record, I was entitled to travel internationally. And I did travel internationally. I was gone probably every 10 days. And it was a great deal. It was very rewarding. I've been all over the countries in Europe. You may remember in April 2010, there was a huge volcano eruption in Iceland. I arrived in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, that morning, and I went to the hospital, gave it, we call it product for discretion. I gave the product up and I went back to the hotel to crash. That evening I was going down with the shuttle bus to get a bite to eat in Amsterdam, and people were complaining that they couldn't get home because all flights were canceled. So I got stuck for 8 nights in Amsterdam. If you have to get stuck in Europe, Amsterdam ain't a bad place to be stuck. But I remember calling the program the next day and saying, as they knew air flights weren't flying, and I said, I'm stuck, I'll pay my own expenses. And they said, no way, you're there because of us. And they were adamant in paying my hotel reservations. But it was a very lovely thing to be able to do. There's an awful lot I could go on, but I choose not to. The donor program was operated under what they call NMDA at the time, National Marrow Donor Program. Today it's called Be the Match. And it's very easy to join unless you're over 70. That's the max. And they put a Q-tip, a cotton swab in your mouth, and they take a sample of your saliva. And from that, they know it's sort of your DNA of your blood. And I don't think I mentioned knowing Jay Finch before we moved here, did I? No. Okay. In November before we moved here of 2023, my wife gave a talk in the formal dining room, and she was involved with hospice care in the Low Country, now called Mirasol Health. And it was on having the conversation. And we sat at a table, had lunch before her remarks. Janet and I were at the table. Lee Niner and his late wife Liz were there, whom we knew for years. And then the other couple was Bonnie and Jay Finch. Jay was sitting beside me, and I'm talking to Jay. I said, what did you do? And he said, I was an engineer. And I said, oh. And he said, then I went to law school. And I said, where'd you go to law school? He said, Duquesne. And I said, Pittsburgh. He said, that's right. And later on, he said, what about you, Jim? And I said, I spent my career in the natural gas industry. And he looked at me and he said to me, Jim, you lived in Binghamton. And I said, that's right. And his comment was, we met. And what it was is the Columbia Gas System had a huge amount of lawyers. Every year they had a lawyer conference, and it would rotate locations. And once or twice when it was in my locations, I was a speaker telling them what was going on in Washington and the States. And he remembered that. I think he may even remember to this day some of the sad jokes I was telling. But that's sort of my career. And I have retired. I stayed active in retirement. I spent 19 years as a volunteer with the Hilton Head Island Concours. I did not have the title, but I was the de facto operations manager. You may know Louis Justice from our maintenance department. He's a long-term volunteer. He and his wife used to make 25 gallons of chili on Saturday and Sunday for the volunteers. It's been a lot of fun. I've stayed in that. I'm still active with Mercedes-Benz. And I just have to say that I'm very fortunate. I've enjoyed my career. It's a varied career. As Lee said, not many people begin and end. But I really had 3 very different careers with the same employer, which just doesn't happen. Finally, I'd like to thank you. Janet and I have been welcomed here at Tide Point. You've been very welcoming. It's nice to feel belonging, all right? And as I said, thank you, friends, neighbors, right, members of Tide Point. We really enjoyed being here. I hope you enjoyed some of my remarks, but I really hope you enjoyed all the sexual fantasies I brought you. Thank you very much. Oh, by the way, there's a Tide Point member and his wife who came on one of the German trips, right? And it is obviously Hans Weidekamper and his wife Festi, right? They used to summer in Germany, and one time they joined the trip, and I hope you had a good time.
But you forgot to tell that I asked you, is it okay if I take my BMW?
That's right. That's exactly right. Hans, when he was in Germany, drove a BMW, a big 7 Series, and he met me at the hotel where we were staying. It was a gorgeous car. It was a very limited production model. We would call it individual. The Germans call it individual. It was a brilliant royal blue, and I remember to this day a lipstick red interior. It was a knockout.
Do you have any questions for Jim? Any questions at all?
You can tell it's near cocktail time.
We thank you for coming, and we are still looking for speakers. So if you'd like to be in that chair someday and give your story, we'd love to have you. Next month we have Caroline Schoonover, who's going to be talking about our Moroccan trip. She went with her husband Jim, who has a problem walking, and they took a tour with a Moroccan disabled tour company just for disabled people. And she's going to tell you all about her 2-week or 3-week trip to Morocco. So I hope you'll be here. That will be the second Monday in June. Okay? And we need speakers, but thank you for coming and enjoy the night. See you next month. Great job.
Your time too, and advertisements. You have